Hi, welcome back to Live and Breathe Horses, and it's story time. Today we're going on with this fabulous book, More Than a Horseman, a collection of stories about Tom Dorrance, which was put together by his wife Margaret and by John St. Ryan. And today's story comes from John St. Ryan himself. We're hiding inside because it keeps being so windy. Well, we're not hiding, we're just being inside. I always like to try and record outside, but it was, I keep getting caught by wind and rain. And not so good for the camera and the microphone. Anyway, here we go. Over the years, I took horses up to work with Tom. Some were pretty straightforward and some were one step from the cannery. Tom treated them all the same and showed me how to get the results I wanted. When I look back on the early days, I can't imagine how or why he had so much patience with me. I remember one horse in particular that I took up. She was a big warm blood mare who had developed a nasty habit of rearing, bucking and biting, and that was even before you got on. I picked her up from the barn where she was boarded, and the handlers had to put a muzzle on her just to get her on the trailer. Over the next 3 days, Tom showed me how to feel where she was having trouble, both on the ground and in the saddle, and how to head it off. At one point, I was having great difficulty bridling this horse without getting bitten. Tom was trying to coach me through this as he sat in his mule watching me. I thought I could sense his frustration. But it wasn't anything Tom was giving off. It was just my embarrassment at taking so long to get this part fixed up and feeling pretty inept despite Tom's support. After a while, Tom got up from the mule and walked slowly over to me and the horse. He took the bridle from me and I thought, oh, please don't try to put this on the mare. You see, she'd already taken a hold of me previously by the forearm and flung me across the yard. I still have the scar. So I was pretty mortified to think I should let Tom carry on with this. Of course, while I was in my immobilized state of procrastination, Tom smoothly and swiftly put the bridle on the mare, then handed me the reins. If someone was watching this, they might say, Tom's technique of swinging the bit and chin strap under the chin, gently directing the mare's nose towards him while supporting her chin, made all the difference. But what really made the difference was that Tom's feel and timing was so in tune that he made the mare look like Grandma's horse. Some people say Tom's ability with horses came through because of his innate sense of their nature. On reflection, I don't believe the word innate to be strictly true, because I believe Tom worked at this skill and understanding very hard. As he would say, this is something I've had to develop in myself, for myself, and by myself. The true unity and willing communication between the horse and me is not something that can be handed to someone. It has to be learned. It has to come from the inside of a person and the inside of a horse. Love that quote. He always worked from where the horse was at that moment in time, be it good or bad or mediocre. And from that understanding, he was able to make the progress he needed and to help the horse feel better about everything. Tom's place in equestrian history is right up there with all the great innovators of horsemanship, going right back to Xenophon, the Greek commander, born 2,500 years ago. Back in those days, the horse was a war horse, and Xenophon spent his life on the battlefield. He was a man of war with raw recruits to train. Life was tough and dangerous, and yet he understood that paying attention to the happiness and comfort of the horse was primary in their training, especially where he would soon require that same horse to carry him bravely through the terrible ordeal of battle. Tom's way of working with horses also transcended the formulaic approach, which permeates throughout much equestrian work. That was why Tom was so successful in helping so many riders in such a variety of disciplines. He wasn't looking at the discipline, he was looking at the horse. When Tom would say, "You want to feel like you could ride your horse up a telephone pole or down a badger hole," you wouldn't do either, but it will feel like it. That was his amusing way of explaining that willing communication between horse and human. Here are some important principles I learnt from Tom. Feel the whole horse. How unique each one is, and studying their actions and reactions, learning how to present myself in such a way that the horse will respond to what I ask of them. Tom would often go to great lengths to stress the importance of looking at a horse as a horse, which would seem quite simple. He was so sure that horses naturally had tremendous faith in humans, yet we as humans often didn't measure up to this trust. His observations on the horse's natural instinct of self-preservation and our need to recognise this and consider it as we make our approach continually helps to guide me in the right direction and work to develop the confidence and bond between myself and the horse. Adjust to fit the situation that best fits the occasion. Understanding that each moment in time is dissimilar. What worked yesterday may need some modification today because of the conditions, either externally, as in a change in the environment, or internally, as in a change in the horse's emotional state. There are still ways to get the job done. It's not necessary to abandon the project, but there may be a better time or a different approach. Getting the horses to feel that they would rather be with me, whether I was on the ground or on their back. This phrase from Tom is always a point of reference for me. When your horse is out in 5 acres and you want to bring him in and do some work, it can be pretty miserable if he doesn't want to take part in the proceedings. And the horse will tell you as plain as anything if that's how he feels. There are ways to achieve the goal you want without making life miserable for the horse, and that's something I believe that Tom carried through into his everyday life and his dealings with people. Every time I visited Tom, I came away with a great sense of well-being and contentment. Just being with him was so rewarding. And although I couldn't do everything he asked me to do with a horse at times, he never threw his hands up in despair or quit me. We'd just take a fresh start. I never felt bad, and I really wanted to try to learn what he was offering. I think about this a lot with the horses I'm around. I never want them to feel bad either. And I hope I can help them want to learn. And you know, Tom would say, you don't have to do these things in order to get along and do well and be successful, but only if you're interested. And sometimes it's more interesting and rewarding, especially for the horse. Here are a few stories I've learned from being around Tom. Quite a few times when I was with Tom, he'd come up with a funny story. I think it was just to take pressure off me because I had a habit of getting too intense and trying too hard to get something he would be showing me. At first, I'd be thinking there might be a message in this somewhere, but then most of the time, they were just amusing asides. One time, I was bemoaning the fact that I couldn't get any good help on my ranch, and Tom said, "I remember I was with Ray when he was at the 25 ranch helping him with some horses. My neighbour up in Joseph, Oregon, Dick Ratham, called. He said he'd gone out to feed the stock in the morning and he'd ended up with a hernia from all the lifting and the hernia had got away from him, and now he was in hospital. He was headed for surgery. Now his cows were due to start calving in about a week, and he told me he looked all around for someone to help out, and he couldn't find anybody that could help him through this. He was in a bind. So I told him I'd head on up there and help him out. I got there the day before the surgery. On the way up, I had the radio on. That was the year that Jack Kennedy took over the presidency, and he was making a speech. He said there were 6 million unemployed, and that was not acceptable, and this was something that we had to do something about. So when I finally got up there to Joseph and got to visit Dick in hospital, I told him about this speech on the radio and that Jack Kennedy had said there were 6 million unemployed. And I said, Dick, you told me you couldn't find anybody. Now somebody's lying. One time I asked Tom about using dogs for help with the work on the ranch. He said, I remember back in 1915, there was a time there that Dad had a dog, Jim had a dog, Bill had a dog, Fred had a dog, and I had a dog. Now that was 5 dogs, and Dad thought we could get by with less dogs. So Bill and Fred suggested he get rid of his first. That kind of put a stop to the conversation. But anyway, they were a big help. Any dog that would work was helpful, but a good dog could replace 2 people. Like if you were in the brush or where the cattle might scatter if you're out in the open. I asked Tom what breed of dog they were. They were just mixed, whatever showed up. Of course, later they were border collies, but earlier on, a lot of the time, it would be just someone who had a dog and they didn't really have a job for the dog. Like some of the ranchers who just ran sheep, and maybe a dog was a little too hard on the sheep. But he would work good on cattle. You're liable to get your best dog that way. Of course, the dogs worked hard, but they didn't always last too many years before their feet would break down. But I worked a lot alone, and I'd like to keep 2 dogs, because in the summertime their feet would get sore and cracked on the dry ground, but if I could lay the dog off for a spell, it would recover. Sometimes I was down to a pretty ordinary dog for a while, and it's like so many things. When you have a good dog, you don't think that much about it, but when you don't have one, you begin to realise how valuable they are. I remember seeing Tom wearing gloves on occasion at clinics, and some of them had duct tape around the fingers. I thought I'd buy him a new pair and suggested that one day. He looked at me with an amused expression, with that amused expression that he would get, and he said, I suppose you think that there's a hole in these gloves? Well, yeah, obviously. Tom nodded gently and gave me that look. Well, you see, there was going to be a hole. At that point in my life, there was a blinding flash of what an odd thing to say. And then a sudden aha moment of, oh, you mean if you hadn't fixed it up before it happened? So you see, even with a simple thing as worn gloves, Tom had a way of teaching you something valuable. Many years ago, Ray Hunt was telling me how much Tom had helped him with his horse Ondo. It was hard for me to appreciate how Ray would need help, as he was such a phenomenal horseman in his own right. Of course, this was when Tom and Ray first met, but I was really intrigued about the specifics, so I asked Tom if he would tell me more about this. Tom said, the first time I got with Ray and Ondo, I just asked Ray to start in on him and act like I wasn't there. I'd just watch for a while. I asked Tom how troubled did the horse seem to him at the time. At first, Ray had a difficult time to catch him, but then, when he did catch him, He brought him inside the barn and started to brush him. And all the time this was going on, this horse was getting a little more uneasy. Ray had given the horse some oats, and as he started to saddle him, the horse stopped eating. He was really getting tight. Now Ray wasn't doing anything to disturb the horse, and I could see that the horse had confidence in Ray. But inside of this horse, he was real squirmy. After Ray saddled him, he started to lead him out of the barn. It was a kind of narrow alley, and to this day, I don't know why that horse didn't buck right over the top of Ray. He was so tight. But Ray got him out in the corral, and he said to me, "So, what do we do with him now?" I said, "Take him into the centre of the corral, pet him a little, then slip the halter off him as easy as he could, and then get clear out of the corral as quickly as he could." So we did that, and that horse, he just stood there. He was afraid to move, because when Ray wasn't there, he didn't have any security. He stood there for a little bit, and then all at once he exploded. He really turned it on. I said to Ray, "The last thing that horse wants to do is to buck." Ray said it sure didn't look like that to him. But anyway, Ray worked him around there, just wearing the saddle. The horse got up a pretty good sweat, and after a while, he kind of calmed down a little bit. I asked him to take the saddle off and rub him where the saddle and pad had been, then resaddle him again. He did that about 3 or 4 times, and each time the horse was getting a little bit more at ease. Then I had him work alongside the fence. Ray would be up above him and bring the horse alongside. When he came in and he was real scared and he'd come in real close and tight to the rails, then Ray would reach down and work the stirrups a little, swinging them back and forth, then send the horse out a little ways, bring him back and pet him. Then Ray unsaddled him, and I asked Ray to take him out of the corral and find a soft spot outside and lay him down. He worked at that quite a bit before the horse got to feeling like he could do it without resisting too much. It wasn't easy for him. It was kind of a wearing process as well. Then I said to Ray, now would be a good time to give him a break with some feed and water, then put him back in with the other horses. Then we'd get some lunch. When we came back after lunch, Ray caught the horse, saddled him and rode him. It looked to me like there was quite a difference, but he was still teetering. We put him away and started in on him the next morning. He was much better and we rode out a little. You see, when this horse bucked, it wasn't because he was scared and he got to panicking. He was likely to buck into something or over a bank. He was dangerous that way, and Ray could see that. It wasn't a very comfortable feeling. But it looked to me that with what Ray had going for him and what he had to offer the horse, that he would make it. The horse was good material. It looked to me like the horse was looking for relief as much as Ray, and they had a chance of making it. And they made it. Ray was careful, but they made it. When they'd go to a horse show, Ray said he watched the others running their horses around and chousing them, maybe getting them all buzzed up to go in the show. He said if Ondo was getting a little uneasy, he'd take him out somewhere that wasn't too busy, somewhere quiet, and maybe just lay him down and wait until his call came. Then he'd go in and show him, and that was it. Over the years, as I worked with horses, I so wanted to get a better understanding of everything that Tom had to offer. Tom was so patient with me. He knew how inexperienced I really was, but as in all things, he would always try to encourage you. But he wouldn't want to get you in too deep where his words would be taken wrong or just plain misunderstood. One of the things I was struggling with was getting any real understanding on that third element he would occasionally mention, the spirit of the horse. I'd sit for hours trying to figure this out from things he'd said or had said in his book, True Unity. But it really baffled me. I was, of course, looking for something logical, and that wasn't even close to being in the right frame of mind. Now I think with Tom, if he thought you were ready, he was there for you. But if he didn't think you were ready, you weren't about to convince him otherwise by talking. I remember years earlier when I'd taken a young colt to one of Tom's clinics, and as always, Tom would ask if anyone had a project they'd like to work on. Well, my hand shot straight up, and I asked if he would show me how to lay this colt down. Well, somehow, that first day, he had me doing all kinds of things with the colt, carrying a flag, working another horse from the colt, dragging a tarp, etc., etc., but I never got to lay him down. So the next day, when we started, and Tom asked for projects, not being too shy, I stuck my hand up again and I asked if he'd show me how to lay this colt down. Well, that day, he had me stopping better, turning around a little, helping others with more troubled horses, but you guessed it, we didn't even talk about laying the colt down. Now this happened for 2 more days, and I wasn't frustrated or disappointed. It was just that at the end of the 4 days, I still hadn't got to lay the colt down. I was puzzled that Tom hadn't even started in on the project with me. So again, being the shy retiring person I am, on the end of the last day, when Tom was saying his goodbyes, I asked him how come he'd not wanted to lay this horse down. And he looked at me very kindly and considered the question and said, "John, the last thing this horse of yours needs is to lay down." I didn't have much to say right then because I was so green about the whole deal. But in later years, I talked to Tom about that, and I said, I guess, at the time, I was missing all the good things that horse was offering to do so well, and I was fixed on this laying down deal. Now, Tom didn't agree or disagree at this. He just smiled, which was enough for me. I've kept this in mind over the years and tried not to force anything in my work. I knew there was a place for laying a horse down, but I figured some of this would be tied into how much you might help a horse, and of course, how much you might trouble a horse. There are 2 ways of spreading light: to be the candle or the mirror that reflects it. Edith Wharton, novelist, 1862 to 1937. This means a lot to me regarding Tom's work. I cannot possibly recreate his way of working with horses and people. That was something extraordinarily unique to Tom. As he said, what he learned from the horse, he got from the horse. What he did had to come from the inside of him and the inside of the horse. And so, I see my goal in the world of horses as the candle that shines brightly on the work of Tom. Of course, I'm working with horses, and there'll be a certain amount of understanding on my part with regards to how Tom might approach a particular situation. Nevertheless, my approach would be a mere reflection of the original. If you look at the dictionary, you'll see that it refers to a reflection as an image, a likeness, a resemblance, etc. And in this way, the work I am doing is still removed from the original. And so, returning to the original quotation, I believe I am both the candle and the mirror. But as I said, It's far more important for me to be the candle and help people discover more from the original source of the light. As Tom would say, observe, remember, and compare. Study his work. There are thankfully many opportunities, either through this book or True Unity or the DVD series. It was important to Tom that he got to the inside of the horse, the in-depth part, what you might at times refer to as the spirit of the horse. I've read so much equestrian literature, from the classic treatise of de la Guernière to the contemporary work of Ed Connell, and these are all excellent works. Tom's book, True Unity, is a classic in its own right. There's just so much information in those pages. On first reading, it appears a little abstract, to say the least. But as you work with horses and reread it, you can begin to appreciate how profound this work is. Tom was very fond of saying to me, "It's all there in the book. It might take you 30 years or so to get to it, if you ever do, but it's all there." When Tom was alive, it took a colossal effort to convince him to write his book, True Unity. Thankfully, Millie Hunt Porter was persistent and worked diligently, recording exactly what Tom said and putting it into print. They are the exact words Tom used when trying to get his message across. Of course, in this day of spoon-feeding information, where a person is bombarded with so much information that they hardly have time to think for themselves, True Unity can come as quite a shock. The book is an actual goldmine and great resource of information. What it does require is that a person thinks for himself or herself. What some perceive as being esoteric and abstract is in fact Tom trying to get the reader to think for themselves. As much as Tom would have perhaps wanted everyone to be able to communicate willingly with their horses, he realised that this way of working could only be successful if the individuals made great efforts to claim it for themselves. No amount of coercion would succeed if the person was not ready or willing to try. It's just the same for the horse. Tom's statement, Tom's statement, "I don't try to force anything. I don't work with people that way, and I won't work with a horse that way," rings loud and clear for some. It's all down to individual endeavour and aspiration. If a person wants it hard enough, they'll study and try. This brought me back to the third element of the spirit that Tom occasionally mentioned. One day we were filming some things for his video, and we were sitting beneath this huge eucalyptus tree by his arena. I thought this would be a good time to ask him about it. I thought maybe I'd got him cornered in a way, because he was trying to help me get some good material for the video. Of course, one thing I learned in time was that you really couldn't corner Tom. If he didn't think you were ready for something, he wouldn't necessarily shut down, but he'd just give you enough of an answer to be polite, I guess, but not very in-depth. Anyway, on this occasion, after a long pause, which I'd learned not to interrupt, he said, "Well, I'm trying to think of words to use without getting too involved and not be misunderstood." He paused again, and then he looked at me very intently. "Okay, now, as we're sitting here in the sun, and it's very pleasant and there's a little breeze, it's just about right, for me anyway, to be real comfortable. Now I can't see that breeze, but it's there. I can feel it. I can feel the direction it's coming from, but I can't see it. And this other deal with the horse, when those things are just right on the horse and the person, and they're both having feel for each other, the horse is such a wonderful animal. And so many times they're trying so hard to get the person to see or feel what they're trying to present to the person. Now, they may be doing different things. It may seem like they're not even close to trying to do what the person is thinking, but maybe that horse is trying to figure out what the person wants, what's going on. And then if they can start getting this together, this is where the true unity term comes in, and they begin to get to feel like they're together. Then the communication is easier, and the horse can be so forgiving when that gets to working. For instance, when you were riding that brown mare yesterday in the arena, and she was coming towards the horses on the other side, her thoughts and rathers were headed in that way. When she got to the other end of the arena, she wasn't too happy about that, and when you tried to direct her on the course that you wanted her to go, she was more inclined to go in the opposite direction towards the other horses. That was her rather, and you had to work at that. Now, you made some tries and she made some tries, and it took some time before it all came together. And then when you were finished, she stayed with you all the way around. And that was after all the tries that you were doing and all the tries that she was doing. And there, at the end, when we settled for that, she seemed just glad to be with you and wherever you wanted to go. You had to kind of go with her for a little while until she sort of got back with you so that you could be together. Now, when you're speaking about the spiritual deal, what is mentioned in the book, very little, but it is mentioned, I tried to think up some word that would do the job as well as using the word spirit, because it seemed like there were so many people, when that word came to the surface, they began to form all kinds of opinions about what that means. Now, some of them might not be too far off, but a lot of them were not even close to what really I'm saying or feeling or thinking. Now, this wind we talked a little about. Can you see the wind? You can see what it does, but you can't see it. But it's there and it's real. There was another long pause, and I knew well enough not to interrupt. Tom continued, I've heard a lot of these things that people do, how they go about torturing other people, and that isn't anything brand new. And sometimes somebody will speak about the horse or the human trying to break his or her spirit. I sometimes think about life, as mysterious as it is, it's a pretty natural thing that people don't want to give up on. Tom looked at me intently for a brief moment, then rocked gently back in his chair and looked up into the trees. I followed his gaze, and we both sat there watching the leaves move gently. So, thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to see you next time.